As usual, once I'm done with polishing the torso or the center of gravity, I work on the contact points of the character, so I will work on the feet, as always. I will start with the right leg as it's going to be pretty fast. First of all, I want to make sure that the leg gets fully extended before the foot leaves the ground. So I will simply delay by a couple of frames the moment the foot leaves the ground. From there, I will make sure that the foot is drawing a nice arc in space, and then I will slightly push the Z location curve to create the up pose of the foot right in the middle. I will then switch the handles to vector for the starting point and ending point of the Z location and X location. This way I make sure that the foot is accelerating when leaving the ground and when it's about to contact the ground. Then I can revise the heel orientation or heel rotation using the heel controller, raising the heel just before the foot leaves the ground and flattening the foot a couple of frames after the contact pose. Then I'm also working on the toes of the character, so as usual I will make them drag, meaning that they will be pointing toward their previous position. On the contact pose I will raise the toes and then I will slap them on the ground one frame later. And I will convert the contacting key of the toes to vector, so that I'm sure that they are accelerating before they hit the ground, even if it's over only one frame. Then I will work on the jumping motion, so I will make sure that the foot leaves the ground late enough so that I get an extended leg. And as I move the foot, I will also work on its quaternion rotation to make it drag. So the ball of the foot will be pointing toward its previous position, and then while in the air, I will make it transition toward its next position, toward the contacting pose. I will slightly open the foot just before the impact so that the character lands on the edge of the foot and it slightly pivots while the weight is shifting onto the foot. Then I will work on the kicking motion of this current foot, the foot that is contacting the ground. It has a specific rotation as we have seen in the reference. It twists to follow the hips and then just after the impact it twists backward very fast. So we have this very fast back and forth motion of the heel toward the target. In this case it's driven by the W quaternion rotation for my foot. And I'm creating this V shape with the curve where when it's going down it rotates toward the target, and after frame 81 it rotates back. To make this motion less linear, I will hold the pose for a couple of frames by adding a new key on frame 80 and 81. And then I will make the foot ease into its rest pose just before the left foot enters contact with the ground. Once I'm done with this, I will work on the last step backward with the same checkpoint in mind as before. I want to make sure that the leg extends a bit before the foot leaves the ground, and that the foot contacts the ground before the weight of the character starts to shift toward the current foot. So as usual, I'm often delaying the moment where the foot is leaving the ground, in this case by 2 frames, and then I switch the contacting pose to vector so that I get a hard contact, and I input a bit of up pose in between using the Z location to make the foot raise in space. From there, as usual, I will refine a bit the heel controller to make sure that the heel is raising whenever the foot is getting pulled, and that is at its highest point just before the contact frame. Then I will switch to the foot rotation and see if I can make it drag a little bit. And as I did before, I want the foot to rotate a bit after the contact as the weight of the character is shifting upon this foot. And also contact first with the inner edge of the foot, and then the foot will tilt to become flat. This creates a slight roll on the ground of the foot that looks more natural than the foot getting flattened directly on the ground as it contacts. As a final detail, as usual, I will work on the toes. Whenever the foot is leaving the ground, I will make the toes to drag, and eventually when it contacts the ground I will raise them a bit so that they slap a frame after the contact. Another detail I wanted to add is the friction of the toes on the ground when the character is twisting to throw the kick. If you flatten your hand on the table and you push on the hand and try to twist it, you will see your fingers dragging in the opposite direction as the twist because of the friction and the resistance on the ground or on the table. So this is what I'm doing here using their Z-Euler rotation. I rotate them toward their previous position. It's the same principle as when we lift the foot, but in this case the motion is side to side instead of being up and down. From there, I've worked on the left foot. At this point, the workflow is pretty linear. I hope you understand what I've been doing before, and if not, you should rewatch the videos. I know how confusing it can be to read the graph editor, especially for beginners, where you are not comfortable with the tool, so talking about poses, rhythm, and spacing might not translate for you watching those curves. If it's the case, jump back to the squirrel chapter and make sure that you practice with this character. During the switch, I'm mainly reworking the up pose so that it's more or less in the middle of the motion of the foot toward its new position. And as you can see, I deal with the Z curve a bit like we did with the bouncing ball, with vector handles when the foot is leaving the ground and hitting the ground, and a scaled key in between. Now, as you have guessed, most of the work was during the kicking. First, make sure that you calculate your motion path. The first choice I did was to make the foot to stay on the ground as long as possible. This way we do get the feeling that the hips is pulling the leg as strong as possible, but also it will allow me to get less frames to throw the kick so that it will be very fast and very snappy. So as the foot is leaving the ground, I make sure that it's very close to its initial pose, so that I will have a big spacing between the starting frame and the contacting frame. We will have a big acceleration, so for the in-between I'm favorizing the first position so that the spacing gets bigger and bigger and we do feel the acceleration of the foot before the contact pose. Once I feel good with this, I will make sure that my arcs are clean, especially on the impact frame. I will slightly tweak the position of the foot from the camera view so that it perfectly wraps around the punching bag, creating a nice arc. Since the punching bag is an accessory, I will pose the bag later on based on the foot motion. But it's not hard for me to create a nice arc from the camera view, considering that the punching bag will be more or less there since we have blocked everything before. Then, when the leg is pulled back, I will make sure that I get a very clean arc and that the foot is accelerating toward the ground. Beyond being bound to your graph editor, you should be more watching and analyzing your motion path. This is the tool that perfectly translates to you the arcs and the spacing of your animation. Then, with experience, you will be able to read this also into your graph editor. As usual, from there I will work on the heel controller. That's pretty straightforward. As the foot is leaving the ground, I'm raising the heel. The only tricky thing is that our character just jumped into the anticipation for the kick. So the heel is going down and then is pushing to throw the kick. So the heel is raising. There is this slight plateau at some point. From there, it's all about building the smear frames. Don't hesitate to work with all the controllers, like the toe controller, for example, to make the foot longer as it's getting pulled from the ground. The trajectory of the knee will also be crucial, so it's very important to track the arc of the knee, and from there, build the shape of the leg. Just think of the leg as a whip. You want to create a nice curly shape with the whole leg that is going toward the kicking position. Make sure that the foot orientation make it drags toward its previous position, and take advantage again of all the controllers. There are tweakers on the tip of the toes, so do not hesitate to make those toes dragging. at this stage, it's not about animating, but really sculpting your pose. There are only 3 frames of your character. They must be perfect. One tip to get a smoother shape is to hide the heel of the character from the camera point of view. You can easily do this by using the ankle tweaker instead of trying to rotate the foot. I'm trying my best to get a smooth shape for the leg. There are limitations due to the anatomy of the character, but also the resolution of his mesh and the number of controllers in the rig. On the frame just after the contact with the bag, I will scale on one axis the shin and the foot so that it feels like they are squashing on the bag. It's like creating an explosion. You start with a thin shape and then you make it very big. And this visual pop will bring more impact to your animation. And this is exactly what we want for the kick. When it's done over one frame like that, it's barely viewable or noticeable, but it will feel for sure. For this kind of shape, I don't really have any rules to tell you or to explain you. What I do advise you is to search for references, like in anime for example, where they do deform a lot the character to get crazy perspective or crazy impactful shapes like that. You will also find this kind of crazy shape in kids' cartoon. I think that's a very, very interesting source of inspiration whenever it comes to stylized animation. Because I guess that as the target are kids, we consider that they have more fantasy or more imagination than adults. And so they would react positively to crazy shapes. But in the end, if you input it in your animation and it's subtle enough, it will work for any public or any audience. For the last step of this polishing stage on the left leg, there is nothing we haven't seen already or we haven't talked about while working on the other foot. So now we need to polish the hips, the chest, neck, head, and then the arms of the character.